For 70 years, Clint Eastwood has been the definition of American cool. The squint, the drawl, the quiet menace that made him the most iconic tough guy in cinema history. Directors, actors, studio executives, they all learned the same lesson. You don't mess with Clint. But Joy Behar didn't get the memo. When she brought up the empty chair, that moment from 2012 that Clint has called his biggest regret, something in the studio changed. What he said next wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. It was delivered in that low, gravelly whisper that has terrified audiences for decades. And it made Joy Behar do something she's never done before. She ran. Subscribe now, because you're about to watch a living legend remind everyone exactly why you don't pick a fight with Dirty Harry. The View studio had never been quieter. Clint Eastwood walked in, slowly, deliberately, his 96 years evident in his careful movements, but his presence still commanding every eye in the room. His hair was silver white now, his face deeply lined, but those eyes, those famous pale blue eyes, were as sharp as ever. The interview started beautifully. Whoopi welcomed him like the legend he was. They'd known each other for decades, respected each other's work. They talked about Juror Number 2, about Nicholas Holt's performance, about the moral complexity at the heart of the story. 40 films as a director, Whoopi said, shaking her head in admiration. That's an incredible legacy, Clint. Eastwood shrugged slightly. Just kept showing up, did the work. The audience laughed appreciatively. This was the Clint Eastwood they loved, humble, laconic, the antithesis of Hollywood ego. Sarah asked about his directing style, his famous efficiency on set. Eastwood explained his philosophy in that slow, measured way of his. Trust your actors, don't overthink it, capture the moment and move on. Life's too short for 100 takes, he said. You either got it or you don't. Then Joy leaned forward, and Clint's eyes shifted. Clint, I want to ask you about something from your past. Eastwood's expression didn't change, but something in his posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Go ahead. The 2012 Republican National Convention. The empty chair. You've said it's your biggest regret. But I have to ask, what were you thinking? It was bizarre. It was embarrassing. And frankly, it made a lot of people wonder if you'd lost your edge. The studio went cold. Eastwood stared at Joy for a long moment. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. The other hosts shifted nervously. The audience held its breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the room. You want to talk about that? It wasn't a question. I think it's relevant to... Relevant to what? Eastwood's voice cut through hers like a blade. To a conversation about filmmaking? To my 40th film? To a career that spans 7 decades? Joy tried to maintain her composure. I think it's relevant to understanding who you are as a public figure. You don't know anything about who I am. The words landed like stones dropping into still water. I've given hundreds of interviews, Eastwood continued, his voice still quiet but carrying an edge that made everyone lean forward. Thousands, maybe. And every few years, someone like you decides to bring up that moment. Like it defines everything I've ever done. He leaned forward slightly, and even at 96, the movement was vaguely threatening. I was 82 years old. I made a mistake. I've said it was a mistake. I've owned it publicly more times than I can count. And you know what? That's more than most people do in this town. Most people bury their mistakes, pay publicists to make them disappear. I stood up and said I was wrong. Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Eastwood wasn't finished. What have you ever admitted you were wrong about, Joy? The question hung in the air like a challenge. I'm not the one being interviewed, Joy started. No, you're the one doing the attacking. Eastwood's voice rose slightly, not shouting but harder. There's a difference between asking questions and ambushing someone. You invited me here to talk about my work. Instead, you want to relitigate a moment from 14 years ago because you think it'll make good television. He gestured around the studio with one weathered hand. I've been making movies since 1955. I've directed 40 films. I've won 4 Academy Awards. I've worked with every major star of the last 50 years. And you want to reduce all of that to one improvised moment at a political convention? Joy's face was flushing. I'm simply asking. You're not asking anything. You're attacking. And you're doing it because you think I'm an easy target. An old man who made a political choice you didn't like. He shook his head slowly. That's not journalism. That's a hit job. I think you're being overly sensitive, Joy said, her voice getting defensive. I'm entitled to ask about your public political statements, and I'm entitled to point out that you're not interested in a conversation. You're interested in embarrassment. Eastwood stood up slowly, and even at his age, his full height was impressive. I've been watching this show for years. I know what you do. You find the one thing that'll make your guest uncomfortable, and you hammer it until they break. He walked toward the panel desk, his movement slow but deliberate. Each step seemed to carry the weight of 7 decades in the spotlight. But here's the thing, Joy. I've been facing down people who wanted to break me for 70 years. Directors who said I couldn't act. Critics who said I couldn't direct. Studio executives who said I was finished after every picture that didn't perform. Sergio Leone took a chance on me when Hollywood wouldn't, and I proved them all wrong. He paused, letting that sink in. I've been called a fascist for playing a cop who believed in justice. I've been called out of touch for making movies about traditional values. I've been written off more times than I can count. And every single time, I kept showing up, kept doing the work, kept making pictures that people actually wanted to see. The audience was completely silent now. Even the camera operators seemed frozen, transfixed by the quiet intensity of the moment. You want to know about the empty chair? Fine. I'll tell you about the empty chair. I was trying to make a point about leadership, about accountability. I went out there without a script, without preparation, and I improvised. I did it badly. The execution was poor. The moment got away from me, and I've regretted it ever since. Not because of what I was trying to say, but because of how I said it. He looked directly at Joy now, and his eyes, those famous pale blue eyes that had made audiences hold their breath for decades, were boring into hers. I've apologized for it, publicly, multiple times. I've called it a mistake. I've owned it in every interview where someone brings it up. What more do you want from me? His voice dropped even lower, more dangerous. But here's what I don't regret. Having the courage to stand up for what I believe in. Having an opinion and being willing to express it publicly. In this town, in this country, that's becoming a crime. If you don't think exactly the right thoughts, say exactly the right words, support exactly the right causes, you get crucified. He looked around the studio, his gaze taking in the cameras, the lights, the silent audience. I've watched this industry change over 70 years. I've seen good people destroyed for minor mistakes. I've seen careers ended over single comments. I've seen the mob mentality take hold, where one misstep means total annihilation. And I've watched as people like her, he gestured toward the empty chair where Joy had been, people with platforms and microphones and audiences, feed that monster. They hunt for the mistake. They dig for the scandal. They wait for someone to slip up so they can tear them apart. And they call it journalism. His voice hardened with something that sounded like decades of frustration finally finding an outlet. It's not journalism. It's a blood sport. And the people who play it don't care who gets hurt, as long as the ratings are good and the clicks keep coming. He looked directly at Joy's empty chair. And people like you are the ones holding the nails. Joy's composure was cracking now. That's not fair. Fair? Eastwood's laugh was short and bitter. You want to talk about fair? Fair is judging a man by his body of work, not by one mistake he made 14 years ago. Fair is acknowledging that people can be wrong about something and still be good at what they do. Fair is having a conversation instead of an execution. Fair is treating guests like human beings instead of targets. He turned to address the audience directly, and his voice softened slightly. I've made 70 movies as an actor, 40 as a director. I've told stories about war, about justice, about redemption. about what it means to be American. I've explored moral complexity in a medium that increasingly wants everything black and white. And this is what she wants to talk about. A moment I've already apologized for. A mistake I've already owned. A wound that I've said over and over, I wish I could heal. He turned back to Joy. What does that tell you about her priorities? What does that tell you about what she values? Not art, not conversation, not truth. Just the gotcha moment. Just the blood in the water. I have a right to ask challenging questions, Joy insisted, but her voice was shaking now. Challenging? Eastwood repeated. There's nothing challenging about bringing up someone's worst moment. A child could do that. Challenging would be asking me about the themes in my work. Challenging would be discussing whether American cinema has lost its way. Challenging would be exploring why studios bury quality films while promoting garbage. He paused, his voice dropping to that famous low register. You want to know what's challenging? Making a movie at 94 years old. Getting up at 5 in the morning, being on set for 12 hours, making decisions that will affect hundreds of people's livelihoods. Telling stories that mean something in an industry that increasingly values spectacle over substance. He gestured toward the ceiling, where the studio lights blazed. My last film, the one we're supposedly here to discuss, got 93% on Rotten Tomatoes. Critics loved it, audiences loved it, and Warner Brothers released it in 35 theaters. 35. After 50 years of making pictures for that studio, after billions of dollars in box office, they buried it because adult dramas don't fit their algorithm anymore. His voice hardened. That's a story worth discussing. That's a conversation worth having. But that would require preparation. That would require thought. That would require actually caring about the answers. It's much easier to just find the wound and poke it, isn't it? Joy stood up now, her face red with anger and embarrassment. I don't have to listen to... No, you don't. Eastwood's voice was calm, almost gentle now. You can walk away. That's your right. Just like it was your right to turn this interview into an attack. We all make choices, Joy, and then we live with them. He straightened his blazer with a slow, deliberate motion. I've lived with mine for 96 years. I've made mistakes. I've admitted them. I've learned from them. The question is, can you say the same? Can you live with yours? The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity. The cameras captured everything. Joy's trembling hands, the sweat on her forehead, the way she kept glancing toward the wings as if looking for an escape route. Whoopi had her hand over her mouth, watching in stunned silence. Sarah was staring at her notes so intently she might burn a hole through them. The newer hosts looked like they were witnessing the end of an era, because in a way, they were. And Clint Eastwood just stood there, waiting, patient, like a gunslinger who knew his opponent was already beaten, like the man with no name, facing down one last adversary, like Dirty Harry, daring someone to make his day. The silence stretched on. 1 second. 2. 3. The tension was almost unbearable. Finally, Joy did something unprecedented. She pulled off her microphone with shaking hands, fumbling with the clip twice before finally getting it loose, set it down on the desk with a clatter, and walked off the stage without another word. No defense, no comeback, no final shot, just retreat. The studio erupted in shocked gasps. Camera operators swung to capture her exit. Producers in the control room were frantically talking into headsets. The other hosts sat frozen, looking at each other with expressions that ranged from shock to something that might have been relief. Eastwood watched her go, his expression unreadable. That famous squint, those pale blue eyes. After 7 decades of facing down every kind of adversary on screen, this one had taken less than 10 minutes. Then he turned back to face the remaining hosts and the audience, and something that might have been sadness flickered across his weathered face. That's unfortunate, he said quietly. I didn't come here for that. I came here to talk about a movie I'm proud of, a story worth telling. He sat back down in his chair with the same careful economy of movement. But I don't apologize for defending myself. I've spent my whole life doing what I think is right. Sometimes I've been wrong, but I've always stood up for my beliefs." He looked directly into the camera. "That's all any of us can do. Stand for something. Be willing to defend it. And when you're wrong, admit it. That's what I tried to teach in my films. That's what I tried to live in my life." And then, remarkably, Clint Eastwood continued the interview. For the remaining 15 minutes of the segment, he talked about Juror Number 2 with genuine passion. He discussed the moral complexity of the story, how it forced audiences to confront uncomfortable questions about justice and self-preservation. He talked about Nicholas Holt's performance, how the young actor had captured something essential about American guilt and responsibility. He praised Toni Collette and J.K. Simmons, talked about the importance of ensemble acting, shared stories from the set that made even the stunned hosts laugh. He was thoughtful, articulate, engaged, the consummate professional doing what he'd done for 7 decades, the master craftsman discussing his final work with the same care and precision he'd brought to every project. When the segment ended, the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 2 minutes. Some were crying, others were cheering. It wasn't just applause for the interview, it was applause for a lifetime, for 70 years of entertainment, for 40 films that would outlive everyone in that room. Eastwood acknowledged it with a small nod, that famous almost smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the squint, the quiet dignity, the same presence that had made him a legend. "Appreciate you having me," he said to Whoopi. "Sorry it got complicated." Whoopi shook her head, her eyes glistening. "You have nothing to apologize for, Clint. Absolutely nothing." As he walked off the set, slowly, but with his head held high, the cameras caught Whoopi wiping her eyes. Sarah was still staring at the empty chair where Joy had been sitting, as if she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. In the control room, producers were already fielding calls. This clip was going to be everywhere. This moment was going to define the week. The clip became the most watched moment in View history. "Clint Eastwood destroys Joy Behar," trended worldwide within the hour. But what resonated wasn't just the confrontation. It was Eastwood's quiet dignity throughout. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't cursed or threatened. He had simply told the truth, in that measured way of his, and let it speak for itself. Joy Behar didn't appear on The View for the rest of the week. When she returned, she offered no apology, no explanation, just a return to business as usual. But viewers noticed she never again brought up a guest's past mistakes without careful consideration. As for Eastwood, he returned to his quiet life in California and Hawaii, content with the knowledge that he'd said what needed to be said. His 40th film might have been buried by the studio, but his legacy was secure. Because at 96 years old, Clint Eastwood had reminded the world of something important. You can disagree with someone's politics and still respect their work. You can acknowledge someone's mistakes and still honor their achievements. And you should never, ever underestimate a man who's been standing his ground since before you were born. What did you think of this confrontation? Was Joy out of line, or was she asking fair questions? Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that will absolutely blow your mind.